Okay, so we're moving on to some animal phyla. We're not going to be talking about all of the animal phyla that are out there, but some main ones that I want you guys to know. And animals, with all the organisms within the animal kingdom, are classified using a few criteria. Actually, I should say several criteria, more than just a few. But I'm going to talk you through some of those criteria that scientists look at as they're classifying. So one of the main ways is by their body planes. So like how you can find symmetry within their structure. Okay, so for example, with a sponge, okay, a sponge is a very simple organism. Okay, I don't know if y'all have ever seen a sea sponge, but you couldn't cut it in any direction and it'd be literally identical. Okay, so that means it doesn't have any symmetry. Okay, so that tells us it's very simple. Do humans have symmetry? To some degree we should, right? Like we only have a spleen on one side and stuff like that, but technically we're symmetrical. We have an arm on each side and a leg on both sides, for most of us anyways, unless there's some sort of an issue with that. But as far as the structure of a human, we are symmetrical. Radial symmetry. Okay, so an example of an organism that has radial symmetry would be a jellyfish. And these are organisms that if you cut them down the middle, then they're literally mirror images of each other, and you could cut at any angle and they would still be mirror images of each other. Like if you look at the top of a jellyfish, then if you cut it straight down the middle, it would be totally symmetrical from either side, and then if you chose a different angle, it would still be totally symmetrical from either side. So that's radial symmetry. Bilateral symmetry, so bi means two, lateral means to the side, right? Okay, so that's two sides that are symmetrical to each other. Okay, so it occurs in lobsters, humans, and we basically have different planes. So if you cut a human in half, okay, from like this is called the sagittal plane. If you cut it straight down here, okay, then we would be totally symmetrical from one side to the other side. That's bilateral symmetry. But you can't like cut us top to bottom, which is a transverse cut, and still have symmetry. That's why we're not radially symmetrical. So that's the difference between radial symmetry and bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry, there's a plane that you can cut the organism in where they are symmetrical on either side. With radial symmetry, there's lots of different planes you can cut them at, and they're still symmetrical. So more complex organisms are going to be bilaterally symmetrical. All right. Cephalization. Okay, so this has to do with the brain. So a concentration of sensory equipment on one end, for example, the head with the brain. So organisms that have cephalization or that have some sort of a nervous system that's concentrated at one end of the organism, those are going to be more complex organisms. So like for humans and for a lot of animals that we think of as being more complex animals, they have brains or some sort of a nervous system centrally located. Okay, so acolymates, these are going to be a little bit less complicated. So flatworms would be an example. Okay, so these are going to have no cavities between their alimentary canals, which means that their digestive system is much less complex. So we have what's called a two-way digestive system. We take in our food in one opening of our digestive system, and we get rid of the waste at a different opening. Okay, there are some organisms that have a one-way digestive system. They're obviously less complex. They take in their waste to the same place where they put it out. Okay, so those are going to be less complicated. Pseudocollimates, those have three tissue layers and a cavity formed from the mesoderm and the endoderm, but they're not as complex as like a flatworm. Collimates, so these possess a true column, so that's going to mean that they have a true digestive line, like us and most of these, like a sheep, like a cow, like all these organisms that we think of that have like a true whole digestive system. Those are going to be collimates. They're a little bit more complex. Okay. Yes. Okay. Now here's some examples of some groupings. So within the animal kingdom, these are some phyla. Okay. Remember that if we chop the animal kingdom up into groups of animals that are similar, then we get these different phyla, and then within the phyla we can chop them up to get more specific groups. So For the least complex one, porifera, so sponges are going to be the main example of organisms in that grouping. Sponges are very different as far from most organisms. Okay, so they kind of are in a little bit of a class of their own, and they are in the phyla called porifera, which I can remember that really easily because sponges have pores, right? They have those little, like, they look spongy. And then there's Cnidaria, so that C is silent when you say it. And these are like jellyfish and corals. And so these are a little bit more complex than sponges, but not much. They have like a one-way, like a jellyfish has a one-way digestive system and things like that. They're not very complicated organisms. Platyhelminthes, which I know is a hard word to say, you should never really have to say it out loud. Those are flatworms, so that's like a tapeworm. Have you ever heard of someone having a tapeworm in their digestive system, like a dog or some sort of an animal having a tapeworm? So they're worms, but they're very flat. They're worms, but they're very flat.
No.
That was an accusational look you gave her. So they're very small.
I watch documentaries. So I'll think about it.
They can actually get very long or they can be very small, depends on what type of platyhelminthes it is. But these are going to be flatworms, and I'll show you guys some pictures, okay? And then we have Annelida. These are going to be segmented worms like earthworms. You know how if you look at an earthworm up really close, then it has segments to it, okay? So they're a little bit more sophisticated than like a tapeworm. Yeah, that's how they move, is kind of using their segments. Yeah, so flatworms don't, what now?
You ever gone fishing in a street? Just river parts like
Yeah, it keeps moving. Yeah. Its organ systems are so different from ours, but it still has all the necessary parts to function. Okay, so as we go, we're getting more complex. Mollusca. Okay, so these are going to be snails and clams and octopi. So these are going to be mollusks, and you've probably heard of mollusks before. There are some people who are like allergic to shellfish, and they're usually going to be allergic to most of the organisms that are in the mollusca family. Okay, and these are going to be mostly sea creatures, snails, clams, octopi. What now?
like lobsters, shrimp and stuff.
Yes. Oysters, yeah. And then we have arthropoda. So this should make you think insects, okay, and crustaceans. So we've got insects, spiders, crustaceans.
So a crab is an insect?
No, they just fall into the same animal phyla. Does that make sense?
These are different types of phylum?
Yeah, these are different phylus. Okay, so that's arthropoda. And then I give you some more like specific parameters for understanding each. So like for porifera, they're very simple. Sessile means they don't move on their own. Okay, so if you think you'll forget what sessile means, you can put that in parentheses. So these are going to be simple organisms. They're sessile marine animals, which means they're marine animals that don't move on their own, but the ocean can move them with its currents, and other organisms can move them. They don't have a mouth. They don't have a nervous system. They don't have a specific muscle system. No real organs, okay, but they are composed of cells that can obviously still go through cellular respiration and make energy and function. Okay, then we have Cnidaria. These are going to be, again, coral, sea anemones, jellyfish. So a lot of these have stinging cells called nematocysts. So you probably always wondered, like, how a jellyfish stings. There are some organisms that have, like, have a prong aspect to them that that contributes to this sting, but most of the issue is the cells that are on the stingers called nematocysts. So that's going to be that stinging factor. Tentacles to capture prey is what these guys usually have. So like that's what jellyfish do. When they sting us, we're fine, right? But if they sting something small, like their prey, then it will stun it, and then they can take it in. Okay, y'all seen like Finding Nemo, like when they go through the jellyfish? Okay.
So what makes it sting though, the cells? Like what makes?
It has to do with differentiation when it's developing. So like they have cells that differentiate and help with that nematocyst factor, whereas we don't have those. Or else we'd sting everybody. We don't want to sting our friends. Okay. Platyhelminthes. So these are going to have one body cavity. So we have multiple body cavities, right? We have our thoracic cavity, which is where our heart and our lungs are. We have our abdominal cavity, which is where our digestive system and urinary system are. These organisms are pretty simple, and so they only have one body cavity. Okay, they have a one-way digestive system, so one opening for food to enter, and that's the same place that the food exits. And they do gas exchange by diffusion. So we do gas exchange by breathing in and then having gas exchange at our alveoli, and they are so much less complex that all they do is basically the oxygen just diffuses in, and then the CO2 just diffuses out. Okay. Again. Okay, so Annelida, so these are going to be earthworms and leeches, and similar organisms to that, but those are probably the ones that you're most familiar with. So these have a complete digestive tract. So earthworms, I don't know if you've ever seen, earthworms have feces. I don't know, you might have, I don't know if you ever, played with earthworms when you were little or anything. But they actually do take in the food at one end, and then they have a digestive system that the food goes through, and they gather the nutrients from it, and then they release their waste through a different opening. So that's different from flatworms. That's another reason why earthworms are, more sophisticated than, a tapeworm. Okay? Mollusca, so these have shells. With the exception of octopus and squid, they don't have a hard shell. But octopus is definitely going to be the most complicated organism in this grouping. So octopus and squids, they have eye spots. Okay, so they can actually see. Maybe not the way we see, but they can see. And then arthropoda, so these are going to have an exoskeleton, so they don't have a backbone. But they do have an exoskeleton because they're going to be smaller organisms. They're going to have segmented bodies, jointed limbs, varied means of locomotion. So some fly, some hop, some walk, some swim. So we've kind of talked about some examples of those. They're very diverse, and so because some are like marine animals, aquatic animals, some are terrestrial. So they range in size from a very tiny little mite all the way up to a big old crab. So they're very diverse.
Like octopus, do they make the ink when they're scared, or when
they already have it and they release it in response to a threat?
So they can run away.
Yeah. Mhm.
Don't their tentacles have teeth?
They have suction cups that are actually pretty rigid. Yeah, and then on the underside in the middle, yes. That's a good question. I'll have to look that up. As far as I know, I think it just muddies the water. Yeah, but I'll have to look that up because that's not something I know for sure. It makes me think of Finding Nemo every time. This entire unit, I just can't handle it.
I think Harry Potter and the whatever dust and.
All right, so we're gonna do a dichotomous key using number 6, but we will do that on Monday after our quiz. We're not gonna do that right now, so kind of skip over number 6. We'll come back to it. But a dichotomous key is just a way of relating organisms to each other. Both of these organisms have a nervous system, or both of these organisms have a two-way digestive system, and it's a way of narrowing down organisms based off of their characteristics and relating them to each other. All right, so I want you guys to try to fill out this chart based off of what you know about prokaryotes and protists and fungi and plants and animals, and see if you can kind of figure out how to fill in this chart here. Okay, and then let me see if there's anything I want to cover immediately. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the animal kingdoms. Your homework assignment for this part of your notes is going to be to make a foldable on all of the plant phyla and all of the animal phyla that we learned in class. Now, the animal phyla get much more complicated than that. We're a part of the group Chordata, and that's very complicated organisms. But those are the type of organisms you already know more about, so I'm kind of focusing on the more simple ones. Okay? So for all of the plant phyla that you see there and all of the animal phyla that you see there, you're going to make a foldable. So make a plant phyla foldable and an animal phyla foldable. And I'll show you guys an example, and that's part of your homework over the weekend. Okay? So I'm going to give you guys a sec to fill in that chart, and then we'll talk about the answer. All right, so what do y'all think about prokaryotes? So how many cells for prokaryotes? Unicellular. Okay. Do they have a nucleus? What do they have? What's that called, guys? It's just DNA. Nucleoid. Look at y'all. Method of obtaining energy. They don't. Yeah, which is called chemosynthesis. Okay, chemosynthesis, which we'll just say that they're autotrophs because they make their own food. Okay, and an example. Bacteria. Okay, and we'll do the specific example of strep. Okay. All right. Protists. Unicellular. Do they have a nucleus? Yes. They're eukaryotes. Method of obtaining energy? Yeah, so there are photosynthetic protists like algae, but there are also ones, remember, that do endocytosis and take in food vacuoles, and so those would be considered to be heterotrophs. So both. Okay, and then a good example would be algae. All right, fungi, are they unicellular? Okay. Multi. All right, and then do they have a nucleus? Yes. Are they autotrophs, heterotrophs? They don't make their own food. They do. They're decomposers. They're saprotrophs. So specifically, they're heterotrophs, but if you want to get really specific with it, they're saprotrophs. Also known as detrimorphs, which means that they eat dead stuff. Okay? And remember that they secrete their digestive enzymes out, and then they absorb the nutrients. Okay? An example would be like a mushroom. Okay? All right, plantae. Multi or uni? Multi. Okay, do they have a nucleus? All right, method of obtaining energy? Photosynthesis, so they're autotrophs. So I can say auto and then put like photosynthesis in parentheses. An example, we can say anything. We'll say fern. You could put any example you want to. Animal, multi or uni? Multi. Nucleus. Auto or hetero? Hetero. Okay, and we can say human. All right? A lion. That's a good example. Okay. All right, so we're going to move into populations in just a second.